An emotional and touching story of unexpected connections, impossible choices, and the profound consequences of love and ambition. In the heart of an opulent mansion, two lives from vastly different worlds collide. A wealthy heir burdened by expectations and a determined young woman struggling to carve out her own future. When a secret binds them together, the delicate balance of their lives is shattered, setting off a chain of events that will challenge their values, expose hidden truths, and redefine their destinies. Before we start the story, write in the comments where you're watching from.
The Winthrop Mansion, located in the heart of historic Beacon Hill, looked like a gem plucked from another century. It was a world of gleaming marble, tall windows, and curved staircases that seemed straight out of a movie. To Rachel Carter, that place was as distant a universe as another planet. She passed through its imposing doors every morning, not as a guest but as an employee. Rachel was practical. She didn't have time for dreams or complaints. With a tight routine that started early and ended late, she balanced her job at the mansion with intensive classes at MIT. After little more than a year on the job, she knew exactly what to expect. Curt orders, indifferent glances, and no recognition. It was a simple arrangement. She kept the house immaculate, and the Winthrops didn't even notice she existed. However, Ethan Winthrop, the family's only son, seemed determined to break that norm. It was a Saturday afternoon when Rachel saw him for the first time since she started working there. He was rarely home. At 25, Ethan was everything one would expect of a young billionaire heir, charming, with an easy smile and a lifestyle he flaunted openly. Yacht trips, Hamptons parties, and a circle of friends as wealthy as he was were the core elements of his life. Until that day, he had been just a name to Rachel, mentioned in passing by the cook or the driver. But that day, he appeared in the second-floor hallway while Rachel was polishing the banister. You must be Rachel, right?" he asked casually, stopping a few steps away from her. Rachel looked at him, momentarily confused. It was rare for anyone in the house to even know her name. "Yes, sir," she replied, returning to her work. "Please don't call me sir. It makes me feel like my father," he said, with a smile that seemed disarmingly genuine. Rachel didn't respond but kept scrubbing the metal. To her, he was just another part of the house, attractive but completely out of reach and irrelevant to her life. In the following days, Ethan began appearing more often. First, it was once in the kitchen while Rachel was finishing up organizing dinner plates. Then, another time in the music room, where he was lounging on one of the sofas with a glass of whiskey in hand. He always had something to say, even if it was a random comment about the weather or the garden flowers. "You always seem so focused. Almost intimidating, really," he remarked one evening when he found her folding napkins in the pantry. Rachel looked up but didn't smile. "I do my job, Mr. Ethan. That's all." He laughed but realized he wasn't welcome. "I guess I'll leave you alone then," he said, raising his hands in surrender. But he didn't. Not completely. Rachel began to notice a pattern. Ethan would watch her from a distance, always with that relaxed, unpretentious air, as if unaware of the impact he had when he entered the room. He was the opposite of her, carefree, while she bore the weight of a world he would never understand. One late evening, Rachel was finishing up organizing the library when Ethan walked in, holding a glass of wine. He seemed different, more serious. "You work all the time, don't you?" he asked bluntly. Rachel hesitated, surprised by the question. "I have to work, Mr. Ethan. That's why I'm here." He stepped closer, sitting down in a leather armchair nearby. "And is that all you want to do?" "Work for my family." She paused, her hands tightening around the books she was holding. It wasn't common for anyone in the mansion to ask about her dreams or motivations. "No," she finally replied, with a firmness that surprised him. "This is temporary." Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. "Temporary for what?" Rachel looked at him for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to continue. "I study computer engineering." "At MIT?" Ethan nearly spilled his glass. "You study at MIT?" he asked, laughing as if she had told a joke. "And you work here?" "Tuition doesn't pay itself," she replied dryly. He was silent for a moment, seeming to process the information. Then, a smile appeared on his lips. "That's impressive. I mean, my father would love to hear that. A housemaid in his home is brighter than half the company's board." "Don't tell him," Rachel said quickly. Ethan raised his eyebrows. "Why not?" "Because he wouldn't understand. And honestly, I don't need him to know." Ethan didn't press further. But for the first time, he looked at Rachel not as a housemaid, but as a person with ambitions far beyond the walls of that mansion. That night, as Rachel locked the library and descended the stairs to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Ethan Winthrop was no longer just the playboy she needed to keep her distance from. He was a complication, one she didn't yet know how to avoid. Rachel was used to being invisible. In the Winthrop mansion, her domestic work went unnoticed by everyone, and she preferred it that way. But Ethan Winthrop, with his constant appearances and misplaced questions, began disrupting her routine. It was unsettling. He was intruding on a space she had worked hard to keep safe and isolated. One day, while cleaning the windows of the main hall, Rachel overheard voices coming from the garden. She discreetly peered through the glass. Ethan, wearing a casual leather jacket, was surrounded by friends. They laughed loudly, tossing careless remarks into the air. One of them, a guy with messy blonde hair, pointed at the Jaguar parked in front of the house. "So, Ethan, did Daddy give you the new car? Or did you have to beg for it?" "Oh, it was a gift," Ethan replied with a lazy smile. "He thinks if he gives me expensive toys, I'll stop being a public embarrassment." The group erupted into laughter, but Rachel felt a knot in her stomach. He spoke of his father as if he were a stranger, someone whose approval meant nothing. Jonathan Winthrop, the same man who demanded perfection down to the smallest detail of the house, seemed to be little more than a distant figure in his son's life. When Ethan entered the hall later, alone, he found Rachel in the middle of her cleaning. "They're unbearable, aren't they?" he said, throwing himself onto one of the leather sofas as if he didn't have a care in the world. Rachel hesitated. "It's none of my business." He laughed. "You're good at this, pretending you don't see or hear anything." She kept cleaning. "Because it's not my job to see or hear." Ethan watched her for a moment, as if trying to figure her out. "What if you had to choose? See or hear?" Rachel stopped and looked at him for the first time with something beyond professionalism. "See, I think. It's easier to understand things when you see them with your own eyes." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her as if something in her words had struck him in an odd way. "That makes sense," he finally said, standing and pulling his phone from his pocket. "But sometimes, I think it'd be better not to see anything at all." Rachel didn't reply. She knew it was best not to get involved, but his words echoed in her mind for the rest of the day. The interactions between them became more frequent. Ethan seemed to appear wherever Rachel was. He asked seemingly simple questions that slowly made her lower her guard. One rainy evening, Rachel was in the kitchen finishing up organizing the dishes. The house was almost empty. The Winthrops had gone out for an important dinner, and the other staff had already left for the night. Ethan appeared at the door, his hair still damp from the rain. He was holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "You should be resting," she said without even looking at him. "And you should accept a toast," he replied, setting the bottle on the table. Rachel paused and looked at him. "I can't drink while I'm working." Ethan smiled, as if he had been expecting that response. "Then consider your shift over." "That's not how it works. No one needs to know." She crossed her arms, looking at him skeptically. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan hesitated, his usual confidence faltering for a moment. "Because you're the only person in this house who doesn't treat me like an idiot." Rachel didn't know how to respond. He seemed sincere, but that only made things more complicated. "I'm not your friend, Ethan." "Maybe you should be." The simplicity of his response left her speechless. He opened the bottle, poured a glass, and left it on the table before walking away. Rachel stood still, staring at the wine in the gleaming glass. She wanted to hate him for being so casual, so persistent, but what truly unsettled her was how much he seemed to be telling the truth. One early morning, Rachel couldn't sleep. The tension at MIT was building, with project deadlines piling up, and she knew she was falling behind. She got up and went to the mansion's library in search of some silence. It was dark, except for a lamp lit in one corner. When she entered, she noticed Ethan sitting on the sofa, a glass of whiskey in hand and a pile of papers on the coffee table. "I didn't know you read," she said without thinking. Ethan looked up and laughed. "You're good at sarcasm too, huh?" She approached, curious. On the table were bills, bank notices, and a contract. "What's this?" she asked before realizing she was intruding on something private. "Company stuff. My dad wants me to take on more responsibilities," but he shrugged. "I'm not the kind of guy he wants." Rachel frowned. He's your father. So what? Ethan replied bitterly. Being my father has never stopped him from making it clear how much he thinks I'm a failure. She stayed silent. For the first time, she saw Ethan without the mask of charm and carelessness. Maybe he just wants you to prove you can do something on your own. Or maybe he just wants me to be someone else. Rachel hesitated but sat down in a chair across from him. Have you ever thought about trying? Ethan laughed, but it was an empty laugh. Trying what? To be his clone? No thanks. The two sat in silence for a moment. Rachel thought about saying something more, but decided that perhaps it was better to let the silence speak for itself. That night, as she left the library, Rachel realized she was seeing Ethan in a different way. He was a problem that, against her will, was starting to matter. The stifling heat of Sunday morning enveloped the Winthrop mansion as Rachel scrubbed the floor of the main hall. The dust that always seemed invisible to the wealthy never escaped her notice. She worked mechanically, but her mind was caught on a truth she didn't know how to face. She was pregnant. 2 days ago, Rachel had held the pharmacy test with trembling hands in her small rented room. 2 clear lines confirmed what she had feared since the symptoms began. Ethan Winthrop was the father. But telling him felt like a death sentence, not just because of him, but because of everything that would come after: the judgment of patriarch Jonathan Winthrop, the inevitable humiliation, the guaranteed expulsion. She knew how these stories ended. Women like her were always cast as the villains. Are you okay? Ethan's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. She looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his hair tousled as if he had just woken up. It's nothing, she said, returning to scrubbing the floor. Ethan entered the hall and closed the door behind him. Rachel, you seem different. Did something happen? She stopped, the cloth still in her hand. She looked at him, feeling the urgency in his words. He might have been an irresponsible playboy, but in the past few months, Ethan had shown her something she hadn't expected: a human, vulnerable side. I need to talk to you, she said, dropping the cloth into the bucket. Ethan stepped closer, concerned. Of course. About what? Rachel hesitated, the words stuck in her throat. She took a deep breath, locking eyes with him. I'm pregnant. The silence that followed was unbearable. She watched his face change, from surprise to confusion, and then to something more complex that she couldn't identify. Are you sure? He asked, his voice low. Absolutely. Ethan stepped back, running his hands through his hair as he paced back and forth. She expected him to say something awful, like denying responsibility or accusing her of trapping him. But to her surprise, he stopped pacing and looked at her with determination. I'll take care of it, Rachel. You and the baby. Rachel blinked, stunned. Ethan, I'm not running away, he interrupted. But what are we going to do? My parents, my father will. Rachel nodded slowly. I know. The secret didn't last long. That evening at dinner, impulsive as always, Ethan decided to tell his parents. Rachel wasn't there, but the echo of Ray's voices from the dining room reached her. She was in the kitchen, nervous, trying to pretend she wasn't hearing every word. Are you out of your mind? Jonathan Winthrop's voice exploded. This is irresponsible. I'm taking responsibility, Ethan shot back. You're going to ruin this family. Jonathan shouted. That maid is manipulating you, Ethan. She's after your money, our reputation. Rachel felt a lump in her throat. The cook beside her cast a sympathetic glance but said nothing. Rachel hasn't done anything like that. She's smart, talented, more than anyone here gives her credit for. Ethan retorted, his voice rising. She's a maid, Jonathan said with disdain. And she'll remain one. Are you willing to throw your life away for this? The sound of a chair scraping across the floor echoed through the house. If throwing my life away means being with her, then that's exactly what I'll do. A few minutes later, Ethan walked into the kitchen. His eyes were dark, and his jaw was clenched. You need to leave, Rachel, he said. No. She felt the ground fall away beneath her. Leave? To where? My father said that if you don't leave, he'll fire you anyway. And I'm leaving with you. Ethan, you don't have to do this. He shook his head. I'm not letting you go through this alone. An hour later, Rachel was packing her belongings in the small room she had in the back of the mansion. It was a cramped space, barely decorated, but it was the only place she could call home. Ethan appeared at the door with a backpack slung over his shoulder. "Is this real? You're really leaving?" she asked, looking at him. "If I stay, I'll lose both of you. I'm not letting that happen." Rachel didn't respond. She felt a mix of gratitude and fear. Gratitude that he wasn't running away, but fear of what would happen next. When they stepped out of the back door, the night was cold, and Rachel realized she had no idea where they were going. Ethan's car, a flashy sports convertible, seemed absurd now. He helped her load her bags into the trunk and opened the door for her. "Do we have somewhere to stay?" she asked nervously. Ethan hesitated. "Not yet, but I'll figure it out." As the car pulled away from the main gate, Rachel glanced back. The Winthrop mansion seemed even larger from a distance, like a monster swallowing everything around it. She didn't know if she could survive what was coming, but with Ethan by her side, she had at least a chance. The small apartment in Chelsea was a world away from the grandeur of the Winthrop mansion. The walls had cracks that seemed to whisper old stories. The floors creaked with every step, and the drafty windows let in Boston's autumn chill. Still, it was all Ethan could afford with the little money he had saved, a shock for someone used to luxury, but better than nothing. Rachel looked around, feeling a mix of relief and despair. Relief that they finally had somewhere to stay. Despair at how drastically her life had changed in such a short time. "I know it's not what you deserve," Ethan began, tossing his backpack onto the floor beside the worn mattress. "Don't say that," Rachel interrupted, turning to him. "We're here. That's enough." But the tone in her voice didn't even convince herself. In the days that followed, Ethan and Rachel began to face the harsh reality of their new life. Ethan got a job as a cashier at a local diner, an exhausting and low-paying job that left him coming home smelling of grease and stale coffee. Rachel continued attending MIT, but she was increasingly tired and falling behind on deadlines. The routine was suffocating. Ethan left early and returned late, while Rachel spent her nights studying and preparing the small apartment for the baby's arrival. "You don't have to do everything by yourself," Ethan said one evening, watching her fold donated baby clothes. "Someone has to," she replied, not stopping. Ethan stayed silent, watching her. He knew Rachel was exhausted, but he also knew she would never admit it. Time had not been kind to them. Rent was late by the second month, and electricity was cut off for non-payment. Ethan began working extra shifts, which left him even more distant from Rachel. She, in turn, relied on her MIT classmates to use the labs and finish her projects. One afternoon, Ethan came home early, exhausted after a particularly grueling shift. He found Rachel sitting at their makeshift table, books and notes scattered around her. "You're still studying?" he asked, tossing his jacket onto the couch. Rachel looked up, more tired than he had ever seen her. "I can't stop, Ethan. If I don't finish this semester, I'll lose everything." He sat beside her, resting his face in his hands. "I don't know if I'm helping." Rachel took a deep breath and held his hand. "You're here. That's what matters." But deep down, they both knew it wasn't enough. By the third month, the weather had turned even colder, and Rachel began to feel the effects of stress on her pregnancy. Her back pain worsened, and her professors at MIT started questioning her performance. "Rachel, you need help," said a classmate after seeing her nodding off during a lecture. "I'm fine," she insisted, even as everything in her body said otherwise. When she returned home that evening, she found Ethan sitting on the couch, his head lowered. "What's wrong?" she asked, dropping her bag on the floor. He took a moment to respond, but when he did, his voice was heavy. "I got fired." Rachel's world seemed to spin. "What? Why?" "My boss said I can't keep leaving early or missing shifts." "I wasn't keeping up." Rachel sat beside him, trying to absorb the news. "What are we going to do now?" she murmured, more to herself than to him. "I'll find another job," Ethan said, looking at her with determination. "I won't let you carry this alone." The lowest point came 2 weeks later. The apartment's heating stopped working, and in Boston's brutal cold, Rachel's health began to decline. She went to class wearing a heavy coat and gloves, but her body could no longer endure it. At the end of the day, she collapsed in the halls of MIT and was rushed to the hospital. When Ethan arrived, he found Rachel lying on a hospital bed, her eyes sunken and her face pale. "You can't keep doing this," he said, his voice almost breaking. "It's killing you." Rachel looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't have a choice, Ethan. If I stop now, everything will have been for nothing." Ethan held her hand, feeling more powerless than ever. I'll figure this out. Somehow. She didn't reply. They both knew things had gone too far, but neither wanted to admit how deeply they were sinking. Despite everything, Rachel kept fighting. She knew she had to graduate, not just for herself, but for the baby on the way. What she didn't know was that Ethan was fighting his own battle, trying to prove to himself and to Rachel that he could support her even against all odds. Their fresh start in Chelsea was only the beginning of a journey that would push both of them to their limits. Winter arrived in full force in Boston. Constant snowstorms turned the streets of Chelsea into icy traps. Inside the small apartment, the cold felt even more relentless. The heater had been broken for weeks, and old blankets were all Rachel and Ethan had to keep warm. Rachel was in the final stages of her pregnancy, and every day felt like a battle against her own body. Ethan did what he could, but his termination had left a hole in their budget. He found temporary work shoveling snow from sidewalks outside commercial buildings, but the money barely covered their expenses. "I think Ella's going to be born in an igloo," Rachel joked one night, trying to force a smile as she curled up on the couch. Ethan, rubbing his hands together for warmth, looked at her with concern. "That's not going to happen. I'll figure something out." But the tone in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The snowstorm that hit Boston the following week was one of the worst in years. Temperatures plummeted, and leaving the house was nearly impossible. Rachel, unable to go to MIT, spent her days trying to distract herself with readings and sketches of the project she had been secretly working on. On the third night of the storm, Rachel woke up with a sharp pain in her abdomen. "Ethan," she called, her voice muffled by the sound of the wind outside. He jumped up from the chair where he had been dozing and rushed to her side. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Rachel clutched her belly, her face contorted in pain. "I think it's time." Panic took over Ethan. The nearest hospital was several miles away, and the streets were buried in snow. "I'll figure something out," he said, hurrying to grab his coat. "Ethan, it's dangerous," Rachel began, but he was already at the door. With the help of a neighbor, Ethan managed to find a taxi willing to take them to the hospital. The journey was slow and tense, with the driver cursing the snow at every turn. When they finally arrived, Rachel was rushed to the delivery room. Hours later, Ethan held their newborn daughter in his arms. She was small but strong, with bright eyes that seemed to carry Rachel's determination. "Ella," he said with a tired smile. Rachel, lying in bed, looked exhausted but relieved. "Ella," she repeated softly. For a moment, it felt like everything was going to be okay. However, being discharged from the hospital brought new challenges. The medical expenses were exorbitant. Even with the discounts and arrangements Ethan tried to negotiate, their money disappeared quickly, and soon they found themselves in an even more desperate situation. The apartment was colder than ever, and Ella, still fragile, began showing signs that something was wrong. "She's coughing a lot," Rachel said, holding the baby as she paced back and forth in the living room. Ethan, sitting at the table, looked exhausted. "Maybe it's just the dry air." "It's not just that, Ethan. She needs a doctor." Ethan knew Rachel was right, but they couldn't afford a consultation. That night, he left and returned late, bringing money he had borrowed from an acquaintance. "It's enough to take Ella to the hospital." Rachel looked at him suspiciously. "Ethan, where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that Ella will be okay." At the hospital, the doctors confirmed that Ella had a respiratory infection caused by the cold. The treatment would be simple, but once again, Ethan and Rachel faced judgmental looks and invasive questions. "Don't you have insurance?" the receptionist asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," Rachel replied, holding Ella close to her chest. "Without upfront payment, we can't continue the treatment," the woman said indifferently. Rachel felt tears burn her eyes. Ethan stepped in, placing the money on the counter. "Is this enough for now?" The receptionist gave him a critical look before taking the money. "For now." Rachel remained silent as Ethan handled what he could. When they finally left the hospital, she collapsed onto a small bench in the lobby. "This can't keep happening, Ethan." He sat beside her, holding Ella in his arms. "I know, but we'll figure it out." Rachel shook her head. "I don't know how." Ethan looked at her, determination shining in his eyes. "You're going to finish college, and when you do, you'll change the world. I just need to make sure you get there." Rachel stared at him, feeling a mix of love and despair. "You talk like it's easy. It's not. But I'm not giving up." The months that followed were the hardest of their lives. Ethan worked double shifts at any job he could find, cleaning, deliveries, odd gigs. Rachel, despite her exhaustion, dedicated every spare moment to the project she had been secretly developing. Deep down, she knew it was their only way out of the hole they had fallen into. 3 years had passed since Rachel and Ethan left the Winthrop mansion. During that time, their lives had been marked by an endless cycle of struggles, sacrifices, and brief moments of hope. But finally, something was starting to change. Rachel had managed to graduate from MIT with distinction, despite nearly giving up countless times. With Ella in her arms, she attended classes, presented projects, and spent entire nights in the lab, working on something she knew could transform her life and the tech industry. On that cold March morning, Rachel sat at the small workspace in their apartment. Ethan, now employed at a warehouse, was finishing Ella's breakfast as she ran around the apartment, chattering excitedly. "Rachel, have you slept this week?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with a cup of coffee. "Not much," she replied without looking up from her laptop. Ethan sighed and walked over to her. "You're going to burn yourself out." Rachel finally looked at him. "I'm finishing. It's almost ready, Ethan. And if it works." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ethan knew exactly what she meant. Rachel was developing a quantum encryption system that promised to be the most secure on the market. Her idea was simple but brilliant, a system impossible to hack, based on quantum physics principles that made every breach attempt immediately traceable. When she finally completed the code, Rachel knew she had something revolutionary in her hands. She reached out to a friend from MIT, Emily Huang, who had become an investor in tech startups. Rachel met Emily at a cafe in downtown Boston, carrying a flash drive containing years of work. "You're saying this could replace every current security system?" Emily asked as she reviewed the specs on her laptop. "Not just replace. It'll make everything else look obsolete." Emily looked at Rachel with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Rachel, if this is as good as it seems, you're about to blow up." A few weeks later, Rachel received the news that would change everything. Her startup, Quantum Shield, would receive seed funding. The investment was enough for her to rent a small office and hire 2 programmers to help develop the prototype. When Ethan came home that night and found her crying, he panicked. "Rachel, what happened?" She looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "I did it. Then we did it." He stood silent for a moment, processing her words, before pulling her into a tight hug. "I knew you'd do it." Quantum Shield launched within months and immediately caught the attention of major companies. Rachel was invited to tech events and meetings with executives who, just years earlier, wouldn't have given a young mother from a modest neighborhood the time of day. Among the clients migrating to Rachel's technology were former partners of Winthrop Technologies, the empire built by Jonathan Winthrop. Unaware that Rachel was behind the innovation, the Winthrop company began to feel the effects of obsolescence. One night, while Rachel reviewed contracts on her laptop, Ethan approached her, setting a cup of tea beside her. "You know what this means, don't you?" he asked. Rachel looked up, puzzled. "What?" "You're changing the game." "My father," he hesitated but continued. "His company won't survive this." Rachel was silent for a moment, processing his words. "It's not my intention to bring anyone down." Ethan gave a dry laugh. "It might not be your intention, but it's what's going to happen." She closed the laptop and looked at him seriously. "He'll never know it was me. And if he does," Rachel sighed, "it doesn't matter. What matters is that, for the first time, we're winning." In the months that followed, the signs of Winthrop Technologies' decline became impossible to ignore. News outlets reported the loss of major contracts, and investors began abandoning ship. Jonathan Winthrop, who had always prided himself on being at the top of the market, couldn't understand what had gone wrong. Meanwhile, Rachel and Ethan finally moved out of their small Chelsea apartment into a modest but comfortable home in Cambridge. Ella, now 3 years old, had her own room, and Ethan was finally able to cut back on his work shifts to spend more time with the family. Despite all the hardships they had faced, Rachel felt they were finally seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Quantum Shield continued to grow, but Rachel knew the impact of her technology was only just beginning. Jonathan Winthrop was still powerful, but she was about to discover that the fall of an empire could be much slower and far more satisfying than she had imagined. Jonathan Winthrop was furious. The report on his desk was a disaster. 2 more multimillion-dollar contracts had been canceled, migrating to the competition. He gripped the paper tightly, crumpling it, but he knew the problem was far bigger than a streak of bad luck. Winthrop Technologies, once a titan in digital security, was collapsing. "I want a board meeting tomorrow," he snapped at his assistant. "Mr. Winthrop, the board is already demanding your resignation." Jonathan fell silent, his cold eyes fixed on her. Let them try. But deep down, he knew he was losing control. Meanwhile, Rachel followed the news with a mix of satisfaction and unease. Articles in Boston's leading newspapers highlighted Winthrop Technologies' crisis, but none mentioned her startup Quantum Shield as the cause. Her technology was drawing more and more clients, but she knew that sooner or later, someone would connect the dots. Ethan, on the other hand, seemed conflicted. "It's strange to see this happening," he said, sitting at the table while Ella played with building blocks on the floor. Rachel glanced at him over her laptop. "Strange how?" "My father. He was always so unshakable. Seeing everything fall apart, it's different." Rachel closed her laptop and walked over to him. "Do you feel sorry for him?" Ethan hesitated before replying. "No, but I think I feel unsettled." Rachel took his hand. "You know, it wasn't personal, Ethan." "I know, but to him, it's going to feel that way." Jonathan Winthrop wasn't ready to go down without a fight. In the days that followed, he brought in specialists, held closed-door meetings, and desperately tried to save the company. But the truth was undeniable. His technology was outdated. Executives began jumping ship, and investors sold off shares in panic. "Who's behind this?" Jonathan growled during a meeting with the few allies he had left. "Quantum Shield, sir," one of the analysts replied hesitantly. "And who the hell is Quantum Shield?" The analyst stammered. "It's a startup founded by a woman named Rachel Carter." Jonathan frowned. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. "I want to know everything about her." "No." Rachel was at her new office when she received the news that Jonathan Winthrop had requested a meeting with Quantum Shield. "He wants to negotiate," said Emily, her investor, rushing into Rachel's office. Rachel looked up surprised. "Negotiate? He wants to buy your technology. He's willing to pay a fortune." Rachel remained silent, processing the information. "He doesn't know who I am, does he?" "No. I don't think he's connected the dots yet." Rachel took a deep breath. "Then schedule the meeting." The meeting took place in a conference room in a building in downtown Boston. Rachel arrived first, accompanied by Emily and two lawyers. She appeared calm, but her heart raced. Ethan had insisted she not go, but Rachel knew she needed to face Jonathan. When he entered the room, flanked by two executives, she noticed how much he had changed. Jonathan Winthrop seemed smaller, as if the weight of his losses had diminished his presence. He froze upon seeing her. "You," he murmured, confused. Rachel kept her face impassive. "Mr. Winthrop, thank you for coming." He sat down slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "You're Rachel Carter." He finally made the connection. "You were the maid?" "Yes," she said calmly. The tension in the room was palpable. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "So that's it. All this time, you were planning this." Rachel shook her head. "I wasn't planning anything against you or your company. I was just trying to survive." Jonathan stared at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "You destroyed my company." Rachel placed her hands on the table and leaned forward. "Your company was destroyed by your arrogance, Mr. Winthrop. You thought no one could surpass you. But the market changed, and you were left behind." He remained silent for a long moment, her words hitting him like a blow. "Did you come here for revenge?" he asked in a low voice. Rachel straightened up. "No. I came to show that the world doesn't just belong to the privileged like you. It belongs to those who fight, those who work hard, those who never give up." Jonathan seemed about to say something, but stopped himself. He knew he had already lost. That night, Rachel returned home exhausted but relieved. Ethan was sitting on the couch with Ella, who was playing with a sketchbook. "How did it go?" he asked. Rachel sat down beside him, sighing. He didn't get what he wanted. "And you?" She looked at Ethan and then at Ella. "I already have everything I need." The fall of the Winthrops was complete. Jonathan was forced to sell off the remnants of his company to pay debts, while Rachel and Ethan finally achieved financial stability. But more than that, they found something money couldn't buy: pride in who they had become. The days following the initial meeting with Jonathan Winthrop were quieter than Rachel expected. Winthrop Technologies was officially in bankruptcy proceedings, and Jonathan's name dominated Boston's headlines. The once unshakable tech empire was now a distant memory, reduced to a series of debts and lawsuits. But Jonathan hadn't given up. He wasn't the type of man to accept defeat without a fight. When Rachel received a formal request for a meeting with him, she was surprised. This time, there were no promises of deals or attempts at intimidation. The message was short and direct. "Rachel, I need to understand. Please grant me one last conversation." Jonathan Winthrop. Rachel hesitated before agreeing. The meeting was arranged at a cafe in downtown Boston. Jonathan arrived early, impeccably dressed but carrying the demeanor of a man worn down. He looked smaller than Rachel remembered, more fragile, as if the weight of the collapse had shrunk his presence. When Rachel entered, he stood, maintaining a formal air. "Rachel, thank you for coming." She nodded and sat down without extending her hand. "What do you want, Mr. Winthrop?" Jonathan hesitated before replying. "I want to understand." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Understand what?" "How someone like me managed to surpass you." He frowned but didn't take offense. "Yes, how someone with so few resources managed to create something so revolutionary." Rachel studied him, trying to decipher his intentions. There was no sarcasm in his voice, only curiosity. "Because I didn't have a choice," she finally replied. "You had everything from the start, Mr. Winthrop." "I didn't. For people like you, failure is a possibility. For people like me, failure is the end." Jonathan remained silent, absorbing her words. "When I found out who you were, after everything, I realized how blind I had been, not just to you, but to Ethan as well." Rachel kept her expression steady, though her curiosity grew. "What do you mean by that?" Jonathan took a deep breath, seeming to carefully choose his words. "I spent my life trying to mold Ethan in my image, trying to turn him into the successor I thought he should be. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the problem was me all along." Rachel leaned forward, crossing her arms on the table. "And you think realizing this now changes anything?" Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He looked outside, watching the city traffic, before finally turning his eyes back to her. "No, it doesn't. But maybe it can stop me from making the same mistakes in the future." Rachel let out a short, dry laugh. "Future? Mr. Winthrop, your company is in ruins. What exactly are you trying to save?" He leaned forward, and for a brief moment, Rachel saw something human in his eyes. "I'm not trying to save the company. I'm trying to save myself." The silence that followed was almost palpable. Rachel didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to dismiss his words, to write him off as a man trying to ease his guilty conscience. But there was something in his tone that gave her pause. The conversation turned more direct. "Do you still think it was all personal?" Rachel asked. Jonathan slowly shook his head. "No. I know you created something the market needed. I know this was inevitable. But what hurts is knowing you were in my house. That I could have seen your potential and helped you, but I chose to ignore it." Rachel took a deep breath, keeping her composure. "You never saw me as a person. I was just another maid." Jonathan nodded, his expression heavy with regret. "Yes, and that was my mistake." "It was," Rachel said bluntly, not softening her words. "And that mistake cost you everything." He met her gaze, seeming to accept the accusation. "What happens now?" he finally asked. Rachel looked him in the eye, serious. "You accept that you've lost. You use your experience to help others, if you're brave enough to learn from your mistakes. And you understand that not everything in the world is within your control." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And you?" Rachel gave a slight, unsympathetic smile. "I've already won, Mr. Winthrop. I don't need anything else." When Rachel left the cafe, she felt strangely light. Jonathan was a broken man, but she no longer had room for resentment. All that mattered was that she had exceeded his expectations and his arrogance. When she got home, she found Ethan on the couch with Ella, who was playing with a puzzle. "How did it go?" he asked. Rachel took off her coat and sat beside them. "He wants to change. I don't know if he will, but at least he's trying." Ethan looked at her with a small smile. "And you? Are you at peace?" Rachel looked at Ella, who smiled back at her, and then at Ethan. For the first time, yes. The months that followed cemented Rachel's victory and the Winthrop's downfall. Winthrop Technologies was officially liquidated, and the family lost almost everything. Jonathan, once a feared figure in the corporate world, faded from the spotlight, replaced by headlines recounting the decline of an empire built on arrogance and neglect. Meanwhile, Quantum Shield continued to thrive. Rachel became a well-known name in the tech industry, but she avoided excessive luxury or the spotlight her newfound wealth could have afforded her. Her priorities were clear: to secure Ella's future and to honor the promise she had made to herself years ago, to never forget where she came from. A spring afternoon brought Rachel an opportunity she never expected. She was invited to be the keynote speaker at Harvard's Innovation Conference, an event where the brightest minds in technology share their ideas. Rachel accepted the invitation, though reluctantly. Stepping onto the stage and sharing her story meant reopening old wounds, but she knew her journey could inspire others like her, people who came from nothing and faced the impossible. The conference auditorium was packed. When Rachel stepped onto the stage, dressed in a simple blazer and exuding a quiet confidence, the audience greeted her with enthusiastic applause. She positioned herself at the microphone, looking out at the hundreds of faces in the crowd. 5 years ago, I was cleaning rooms like this one, she began, her voice steady. The statement brought a hush over the room. I wasn't born with privilege. I didn't have a comfortable childhood or the resources to attend the best schools. But I had something that never ran out: determination. Rachel paused, taking in the expressions of surprise in the audience. Working in low-paying jobs taught me more than any book ever could. It taught me resilience, creativity, and above all, how to fight for every opportunity. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. She briefly shared her journey, from her days at the Winthrop Mansion to founding Quantum Shield. Rachel chose her words carefully, avoiding details that could come across as personal revenge. Her message was clear: the world belongs to those who work to change their reality. And to anyone listening who feels the system is against you, Rachel looked at the young people in the audience, many from diverse backgrounds. Never underestimate the power of your own effort. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. Rachel walked off the stage, feeling a peace she had never experienced before. Outside, Ethan and Ella were waiting for her. Ella, now 4 years old, ran into her mother's arms, and Rachel picked her up, spinning her in the air. Ethan smiled, proud. "You were amazing in there," he said as Rachel set Ella down. "I just told the truth," Rachel replied, taking his hand. As they walked across Harvard's campus, Rachel reflected on how much her life had changed. The path had been long, difficult, and often lonely, but she was exactly where she was meant to be. And deep down, she knew this victory wasn't hers alone. It was Ethan's, who had sacrificed everything for her. It was Ella's, who symbolized a bright future. And in a way, it was even Jonathan's, whose defeat had become a lesson the world would never forget. Jonathan watched Rachel's speech on television. He was sitting in a modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston, far from the grandeur of the mansion he once called home. Seeing Rachel on stage stirred something unusual in him, a mix of bitter pride and deep regret. She did it, he murmured to himself. But this time, there was no anger, only acceptance. That night, Rachel wrote an email. The recipient was Jonathan Winthrop. She hesitated before typing, but knew it was what she needed to do. "Mr. Winthrop, I hold no grudges against you. Raising Ella through the countless hardships Ethan and I had to endure only made us a stronger, more resilient, and mature couple. The challenges we faced shaped us into who we are today, and I'm deeply grateful for everything we've built through effort and dedication. You are welcome in this family, and the doors will always be open for Ella to know her grandfather." She sent the message, shut down the laptop, and returned to the living room, where Ethan and Ella were waiting for her with warm smiles as always. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt that the cycle was finally complete.
Hey, how's it going? Leave us a comment sharing your thoughts about this story. We'd also love to know which country or state you're from. Thank you so much for making it this far, and please don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and want to create even better videos for you.